Today I'll be interviewing Dani Bergey, who I previously worked with at the Institute for Systems Biology and who is now a full-time biological illustrator. Remind me the name of the firm you work with?
I work at Cognition Studio in Seattle.
In Seattle.
Yep.
And so she's had kind of an interesting career path in the fact that she's been able to unite her two loves of science and art into an awesome job. And hopefully a little later we can take a peek at some of your work online. But yeah, so Dani, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you chose what you are doing now and how you kind of decided to go that route?
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in South Dakota, in Spearfish, a little town in the Black Hills, and grew up with a mom that was an artist when she was younger, and she doesn't do that for her career, but she's always been very artistic. We always drew around the house and had drawings everywhere. And then my dad is a molecular biology professor, so I kind of grew up with both of those things, in my life. And in high school, I took lots of art classes and lots of science and math. And, you got to a point where you're thinking about college and thinking, which direction do you go? Do you go into art or do you go into science? And at that point in my life, it was kind of felt like you could do one or the other, and you had to shut the other one down a little bit. So I had started really getting into physics and math and decided that I would kind of pursue more of the science field in college. So I actually started in engineering at Montana State University. And about a semester in, I realized that it wasn't quite, what I thought it was going to be. It wasn't as, I guess, creative and artistic at that point. And, after one semester in. So I had sort of thinking about different career paths or different majors that I could potentially do. And my mom had given me a book, I think over Christmas break. I should try to find the name of it, but it was about brain plasticity. And I had never really learned anything about the brain. And I was reading this book and was just like so intrigued by this whole new field that I didn't even really know existed at the time. And so after that, I went back to Montana State my spring semester and found a new department there called cell biology and neuroscience, and ended up switching into that, which was a really, really cool department there. They had a lot of neuroscientists and some MDs that were working there and doing research now too. So I got to kind of explore some of the medical school or pre-medical school classes, and then also some really high-level neuroscience classes with some cognitive neuroscience professors there. And it was just really interesting. At the same time, I was taking a lot of math classes as well. So definitely interested in, combining math and biology. And while I was learning about all that stuff, I had art kind of on the back burner. In my senior year, I started taking figure drawing classes, like I think it was the Figure Drawing Guild at Montana State that I started taking part in, which was really fun. I sort of, revamped that love for art a little bit. Oh no, Jocelyn, I think you're frozen. Oh no, all good.
Okay.
No, we're all good now. Okay. But yeah, then after that, I was still really interested in math and bio, and that's about the time that we met. I moved out to Seattle and started working at the Institute for Systems Biology, and really wanted to learn about how to combine, mathematics and biology. And I was there for almost 2 years. And during that time, I found out about the field of medical illustration, which I had no idea existed up until that point. And I actually did an informational interview with who is now my boss, David Ellert at Cognition Studio. And his background and another employee of his, Inessa, they had just very similar stories, in that they had kind of thought that art and science were very different and you kind of had to do one or the other and shut the other one down. And then they realized, they soon realized that there's this field that kind of pulls both of them together. So that was really inspiring. And as you know, I started taking a bunch of figure drawing classes and kind of building up a portfolio. And I found out that there were 4 schools that you could apply to for a master's. And one of them was the University of Illinois at Chicago, which is where I ended up going. They were a little bit more focused on cell and molecular biology and a little more advanced in the animation fields. And of course, all the schools do all of that, but that one really stood out to me. So I ended up going there, and I trained more in illustration, took more anatomical classes, anatomical visualization classes, and cell biology, neuroscience, lots of science classes, and then also learned about storytelling, visual storytelling. So visual learning and visual thinking and layout and design and kind of things like that. And the second year, we took a lot of classes that sort of pulled all of those things together so that you can really be effective in telling science stories, essentially. So yeah, and then after that, I graduated in 2019 with my Master's of Science from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and soon moved to Seattle, where I now work at Cognition Studio, and I've been there a little bit over a year now. I'm working on we work with a lot of biotech and biopharma companies, and yeah, do a lot of science storytelling for them. So it's really fun so far. But yeah.
That's awesome. And so your main clientele is biotech, biopharma. Do you have academic people that you work for as well?
Yeah, definitely. Especially in Seattle, it's such a science-minded community, and so we do work with academics a lot. Definitely more so in the biotech and biopharma space, but I really personally enjoy working with scientists and really being able to like dig deep into the science with them and think about their science in a new way that maybe even they haven't really considered. So that's really, really fun for me. I'd like to continue doing that in the future, especially, like I said, working with academics more. But
are there any projects you've done recently that you can talk about, that something you were really excited about working on?
Yeah, I'm not sure, how much I really can tell you, but there's one that is in the public domain right now. We worked with the University of Washington, and I'll have to send it to you after this, but we did a whole series with him that is, public domain. It's kind of got the mechanism of action of remdesivir, and then some background information about, the RNA polymerase that remdesivir, impacts. So that was really cool. The audience was higher level too. It was for virologists. So we got to, really dig into the structural biology of the target, of remdesivir's target. And then, of course, digging into the MOA was really high level science. But it was really fun.
The MOA? What?
Mechanism of action.
Ah, okay. Is
Yeah,
that something is it on a website? Could you pull it up for us just to take a look at it?
Yeah, let me see if I can find it.
I want to get into COVID as well, because you were working on a COVID related project before it was even really a thing here, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I got coffee one day, it was in February or something, and things hadn't shut down yet, and we were kind of chatting about it. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can actually pull that up. We have a whole case study.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
There we go.
You see it now? Nice.
Yeah. Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so this is a case study that our company put together. I worked on building the molecular structures early on, which of course now there's tons and tons of papers that are a little bit more recent, more updated structural data, but this was, obviously done, I think it says here, first published February 13th. So we were working on this at the end of January and beginning of February, and we put this whole thing together, and it's updated weekly with new information and new data. But yeah, these of course are the spike protein that you see everywhere, the different subunits, some background information. And then here's the poster, and I'll come back to that in a second, but we can kind of go through the rest of this first.
So can you tell us how you do these structures, what software you use, and how, I mean, they're just gorgeous. I love the detail and the fact that, I mean, from what I can tell, it looks very similar to what we would think of as a protein structure. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so these are actually derived from what are called protein data bank files, or PDB files, which I think that you're familiar with. But there's a whole website. You can go to the PDB and search for really any protein. And there's different entries that, crystal structures and other structural biology techniques. They upload these what are called coordinate data files, or PDB files. And so you can actually get really, really high resolution and multi-layered protein information on these. So you have the ribbon structure, you have the surface structure, there's lots of different types of representations that you can use. And you can pull these into lots of different programs, but the one that I usually use is called VMD. It's Visual Molecular Dynamics, I believe. Yeah. And then there's also a program that's called EPMV. I think, I'm not sure what E stands for, but it's Python Molecular Viewer. And there's a plugin that we use frequently in our animation program, or the software or the platform, which is called Cinema 4D. So you can actually directly pull them into an animation program like C4D, which is really, really helpful. And then, customize it from there. You can light things in there and apply different materials. You just have a lot of freedom with those PDB files. But it's nice because they're the direct files from the structural biology experiments. So they're really, really accurate. And of course, like I said, since we made this, there's been even more research that's been put out about these spike proteins and the membrane proteins and lots of different internal or intravirion proteins that have been published since then. But these are from early on, and hopefully, in the next month or two, I can spend some time updating the structures so they're as accurate as possible. But yeah,
that's really neat. So can you talk a little bit about how COVID, because you really did it was on your radar before, a lot of people here were talking about it. Can you talk about how it's kind of impacted your year and your work and your life, and maybe thoughts on kind of where we're at today compared to, 6 months ago?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like you said, we're kind of thinking about it in January and definitely keeping it on the radar. Cognition had done a similar case study with the Zika virus when that was happening, and so we were thinking this might be an opportunity to get some information out there, visual information that people can digest, rather quickly. And so we started building this case study up, and then, soon enough, a lot of our clients were working on, either vaccines or just background research for a lot of the COVID-related treatments. So we're seeing it in our daily work just all the time. It's ramped up an enormous amount. Almost all of the projects that I'm working on now are related to COVID, whether they're 2D illustration, 3D visualizations, animation, static media. It's kind of all across the board. But it's been a really unique opportunity to be, a medical illustrator right now and be able to kind of keep up with all of the findings of this, this pandemic in a really interesting way. And if you've seen, the spiky blob that's kind of everywhere, that red one that's, I think you saw news outlets, and it came from the CDC, and a medical illustrator named Alyssa Eckert actually created that. So there's just a lot of a lot of medical illustrators are creating visuals for that right now, which is really, really cool to see.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It must be kind of powerful to be somebody who can, provide this visual, information to people during this time, because I think everybody's wanting to, understand it in a deeper way, and kind of, I think understanding leads to a reduction in fear, right? So
yeah.
Can you talk about that at all? And has it changed how you see yourself from your role in society, I guess?
No, that's a great question. I definitely have reflected on that question a lot. All of the visuals that you see out there, there's tons of them right now, and patient education. Like I was saying earlier, we created that whole PowerPoint series for virologists to teach and to learn about remdesivir. So it's really interesting, but it's also a big responsibility, I think, to take on as medical illustrators, because people are very visual learners, and so if you put something out there that gets blown up and gets used, on news outlets and all over the place, you want to make sure that it's as accurate as possible and not biased in any way, derived from real data, things like that. So it's a bigger responsibility, but it's definitely, in my first year of being a medical illustrator, it's been really, really fascinating to see the impacts that one person can have. and then you think about the teams, the companies, and then also just the whole field of medical illustration, helping to convey information out there to the general public. Yeah, it's been really interesting.
Yeah. Is there, because I've heard you talk about wanting it to be as accurate as possible, and I don't know if I'm just remembering this, or you mentioned it in the past, but that you want to work with people that care about that, right? Like the heart organs on the correct side of the body and things like that. Is there a spectrum in that kind of integrity within medical illustration, or would you say that most people strive for that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question too. I think if you think about illustrations or depictions of anything scientific, you can go from abstract to highly, photorealistic, and there's this whole spectrum. And choosing which side of that and where you fall with a certain visualization is a really, really important question that we ask ourselves as medical illustrators as we're getting started on a project. If you think about creating visualization for patient education, for example, you have more flexibility to go on more of the maybe abstract side. There's some information that maybe the patient doesn't really need to know, that it would cause more visual noise for them to try to digest that. And it's easier for them to digest if you can just cut that out and maybe abstract it or simplify it in a way that you're really teaching them, the main takeaway point. But then versus, on the other side of that, you have highly educated research scientists or, experts in whatever field, where if they look at an illustration and they notice that those key details are missing, they're gonna doubt the integrity of the author or, whatever that illustration is associated with. So you have to be really careful about that. And I think it's really important. I personally really like to do a little bit higher level visualizations. I think, with my background in science, especially, I definitely fall more on the side of working on projects where the audience is a higher level, either scientist, physician, or even like higher level medical students, for example. But I still enjoy trying to kind of see how much accuracy you can put into that middle ground as well, but not create too much visual noise that the audience gets distracted or gets confused.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sure. Are there a lot of studios like Cognition, or would you say that most medical illustrators are working freelance? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, definitely. There's a number of studios like Cognition, but most of them are teams full of, just medical illustrators, for example. Cognition is really unique in that we have our science storytelling team, which is built of medical illustrators that have gone through the accredited master's programs and have master's degrees, and many of them are CMIs, which is certified medical illustrators. We also have a design team, which is really cool because we get to work back and forth with designers that are formally trained in visual design, information design, strategy. It's a whole nother field in itself. And I think being able to create a company, I think it was just a really great idea. The owners of the company of Cognition are Dave Ellert and Christine Johnson, and they're kind of on both sides of those design field and then medical illustration. And those two things really feed off each other. And by using them together, I think you can have more impactful visualizations. And, we create a lot of websites. And so we have a lot of visual designers and UI UX designers that can help the science storytelling be again, more impactful. But,
who are you usually building websites for companies?
Yeah, a lot of biotech, like I said, biopharma companies. Yeah, so it's really fun because a lot of times we'll get to come up with a certain style for them, for their visualizations, color schemes, things like that.
Yeah.
It's really fun kind of seeing it from the start, where they just have, their PowerPoint visuals that they're, pitching, and then bringing that into a really targeted style that blends with their vision of the company. And yeah, it's really fun to develop the graphics for a new company or a new website. Yeah.
Yeah. I just saw a new company that Jennifer Doudna started or helped start,
Oh, nice.
co-found Scribe Therapeutics, and they have a pretty cool website.
Ooh, nice. I'll
So
have to check it out.
definitely had website envy. I think we're still working on our website for Tune, so
Yeah.
gotta get that up there. But
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because they're pretty new, right? It's
mhm.
a startup. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they started talking about it maybe last year, and then I forget when they first got going. I think it was like right before COVID hit. But yeah, we're up to like 16 people now,
Nice.
and
Yeah.
5 people here in Seattle, and then we have you know a handful in North Carolina. So
Wow. Nice. Yeah.
so
Everyone's working remotely.
you're working in Montana now, is that right?
Yeah. So that was another piece of your question earlier. I was living in a little one-bedroom apartment in Seattle, and my partner Ben and I were both working from home, and we had just gotten a dog, so it was a little bit too much to all work from home in a tiny little apartment. But we're living out here in Montana. I went to school in Bozeman, and Ben's family lives out here in Helena, so we're staying with them. And Addie, our dog, has like a big backyard to play in, and she's been able to socialize with other dogs more easily here. And
Oh,
yeah,
yay.
it's been great. Yeah.
That's awesome. And do you think you'll be back in Seattle at some point, like working in the office again?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely really like the office environment, just being able to collaborate with people, walk around, and the studio and Cognition Studio in Seattle. The workplace is really beautiful, so I definitely miss having like nice modern workplace to go to every day. But yeah, I think we'll probably move back there early next year. I'm not sure when the office is going to open. I don't think anyone really knows what's going to happen for their workplaces, in the next few
Mm-hmm.
months. But it would be nice to start going back in pretty soon.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's been interesting living in Seattle and then, you know, done a bit of traveling, spent some time in a few different places. And I feel like, generally speaking, Seattle has been not hit quite as hard with COVID as some of the other places.
Yeah,
I know our case rate recently started going back up, but I think it's been relatively steady for a while now, and we're relatively open. Like restaurants and people have gone back to work and in a lot of places. So
right.
yeah.
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's a couple reasons that Seattle has done, relatively well. The first one I think is Seattle is like a big tech center, right? So there's a lot of like Amazon and Facebook. Like there's a lot of people that are already working on their computers, and so the transition to work from home was probably easier than maybe some other smaller cities that are not as tech focused, I guess. And then the second piece is I think generally people in Seattle really understand the the weight of COVID, and they understand that working from home and social distancing and doing all those preventative measures can really help us move through this. I think
Yeah.
they have a little bit more trust and faith that kind of a mindset. So I think
Mm-hmm.
those two things together have been helpful in keeping Seattle on the lower end of the big cities at least.
Yeah, that, and we're really antisocial, right?
Yeah,
I feel like
exactly.
the Seattle freeze benefit. I was like reading in bed on Friday night and just thinking about how nice it is that
I
like
know.
that's like a normal thing now.
Yeah, you don't have to feel
Um
bad about staying in.
yeah,
It's been
exactly.
nice.
But
Yeah,
yeah, it'll be
definitely.
great hopefully when you can come back and get in the office. And
Hmm.
um I definitely agree, like since we're in the launch lab space, which is like an incubator for biotech startups, and we have our own offices, and then the companies have their own like tissue culture suites and everything.
Right.
But even just like going into work and um you know, seeing my coworkers and like, I don't know, it's just nice to feel normal in some way.
Yeah, and connected, and yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I do miss
Um,
that piece of it, but
so I wanted to also bring up the fact that you were one of the first people to get me into podcasts.
really?
Yeah, so
I didn't
when
know that.
we were driving out to Montana for the yearly retreat at Lee Hood's Ranch. And you know, it's a pretty long drive to get out there. And
Yeah.
how many of those retreats did you go to? Were you just at one?
I think I just
One
I
or
think I just
two?
went to one of the Montana retreats. I think I went to two of
Okay.
the smaller ones, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so you asked me if I liked podcasts, and I remember saying like I'm not a podcast
I
girl. Like
remember that now that you bring it up.
I
Yeah.
hadn't gotten into podcasts yet, and you put on you. I remember at the time you really liked Radio Lab, and you put on this Invisibilia podcast that talked. I want to say it was the one that talks about like emotions and how. Do you remember
Yeah.
that one?
I do
Like,
remember it. Yeah. That whole series was really interesting. I think it was the second season of Invisibilia. And
yeah,
maybe we started listening to, the first or second episode, but I do remember,
yeah.
yeah.
And I like that podcast has stayed with me. I've played it for multiple people actually, and I find
Oh,
that one
cool.
really interesting because it talks about like how our brains process emotions, and the fact that like, you know, in English we have like certain emotions, and in other languages there's like not even a word for some of our emotions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it was super fascinating.
It's called Shortwave. It's like a little science podcast. So they have different topics like every week or whenever they publish it, and they kind of dive into them and explain them on a level that, if you know nothing about it, you can kind of come up to speed. But I
Oh,
listen to that
that's
one every once in a while, and it's kind of fun. Yeah.
cool. So I wanted to ask you, since this was kind of recent news with Jennifer Doudna winning the Nobel, I was curious how, like, what that was like for you. Were you excited about the news, and maybe just share?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I don't know as much about her as I know that you have, I think worked with her before, or you've, definitely have a lot more knowledge about her background, but I was super excited to see that. I know there's, been some controversies back and forth about who gets credit for CRISPR. And I think either way, it's such an incredible, idea that is just groundbreaking. And so seeing her get awarded for that was just, yeah, amazing. I was really happy to see it.
Yeah, me too. That was like such a happy day. I think
Yeah.
I was like super excited, and I haven't worked with her, but Fyodor Ernov, one of my mentors, works with her now, and
Oh, nice.
so so yeah, it was just, I think, exciting after, you know, seeing so many men win all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
um and
Yeah.
to have her recognized in that way was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was great.
um there was another question I wanted to ask. Oh, so have you, like, during your career, have you met any scientists like that you were kind of like starstruck about meeting, or have there been any like people you follow that you're always like keeping an eye out for their work?
Yeah. Well, the scientist that I worked with on my master's project, he's a um, epidemiology researcher at Northwestern. Ali Shalatafard is his name. I don't know if you've run across any of his science before, but he is like really well known for, it's called the compass protein and the super elongation complex, which is like a really big regulatory complex in gene transcription. And so I ended up doing my master's thesis on that and did an animation about how that works and the whole mechanism of there's like, I don't know, 20 different proteins that have to come together and bind in certain ways. But working with him was really cool. He's the new director of this Simpson Query Center for Epigenetics. at Northwestern University. And so they had just been working on building this brand new center, doing all the branding and everything for that. And so we worked on this animation with him while that was all in progress. And he's the director, so he's kind of the face of this new center, and it was pretty cool to see that on his webpage and everything.
That's awesome.
But yeah, so then also when I was at ISB, I don't know even if you remember this at all, but Stuart Kaufman, who is like associated with ISB or is an affiliate scientist there, I had one of his books on my desk that I love, and I think I was rereading it, and Sui Huang came by, and he was like, he works at ISB, right? I was like, oh my God, really? And so then like a few months later, he actually brought him by my desk, and I got to meet him. I was definitely starstruck.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was kind of a funny, yeah, it was kind of fun.
I feel like I remember him giving a seminar. Can you tell us a little bit about what he works on?
Yeah, so his background is on complexity theory. So he does a lot with like string theories, and it's a really cool, mixing between mathematics and biology. I think he's an evolutionary biologist in his training. And so he talked a little bit about that. And his book just goes into this book that I was reading, talks about the emergence of really just emergence. So like super complex, chaotic systems, and how, with all of that chaos, you somehow end up with things that are very ordered. Thinking about evolution or just, anything. I think he talks about ants, as kind of an interesting concept as well. But just building order, or, order emerging from extreme chaos, and kind of the mathematics behind it. So it was cool to meet him for sure.
Yeah. What does he say about ants?
I think he studies like, they have ants themselves are very altruistic. And so he talks about they all have kind of their own directions, and they come together to form these like crazy colonies that are capable of doing like incredible things. So again, chaos, each of them is their own individual, organism, but as a group together, they can do something that's like more than the sum of their parts.
Right.
But,
I heard recently that they can form like platoons, like rafts.
I have heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is cool.
Telling me about that the other day, and I just find that so fascinating that it's almost like I don't know, I find some of the like multicellular systems where they're like individual single cell organisms that then like come together to do something. It's so fascinating.
Right. And I don't know much about this, but I think biofilms are similar in that way, in terms of like bacterial, individual bacteria, but together they form these like really elaborate structures called biofilms. I don't know too much about it, but yeah, it's kind of a similar concept. And then E.O. Wilson is another, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's another, I think, again, another evolutionary biologist that he really studies ants and this, idea of order and just the things that they're capable of doing as a colony. But he has a book called The Meaning of Human Existence, which is a really interesting read, and kind of talks about a lot of these concepts of like the emergence of different features out of, hundreds of individual organisms. And yeah, it's a good read. I think the end of it is,
check that out.
Yeah, it's a good one.
You gave me a book a couple years ago that I was just talking about the other day. Proust was a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
Is the title. And it's a really cool book because it kind of gets into different artists and writers who describe biological phenomena that we, like, before we even had a real understanding of some of these systems, like how the brain connects with the body and things like that.
Right.
And I think it's kind of similar in a way to, some of these studies you're talking about with complexity and like tying theory to biology, which I think in my head really pushes like the limits of, it pushes the limits of like what the data can show us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes a lot of sense in a way. Like, I think there's
No, yeah.
so much there, right? That like we're still trying to comprehend because we don't necessarily have all of the ways to comprehend it or measure it. But
Right, yeah. Or you don't even really know what the outcome could possibly be. Like, we're not able to fathom it. So it's hard to design experiments, I think, to solve that type of a problem, especially when you think about, like, I think neuroscience is one example that there's just all of these phenomena that happen, and it's hard to really understand how they happen because we don't grasp that middle level to even design experiments to get there quite yet. But yeah, I love that book. I think it's a really interesting book that kind of brings together art and science in a nice way. I think there was one chapter on Cezanne, the abstract impressionist painter, and how he pushed the limits of what the human eye could understand with just simple brushstrokes, and he would go more and more abstract until nobody would recognize it, and then he would pull it back just one hair. And I thought that was a really, really cool chapter. Yeah, I love that book.
So interesting. And I think something that we always kind of connected on was that, we both were interested in art and science. And I like to say that, they're like two sides of the same coin in a way, because they're both methods that we as humans use to understand the world around us. They have quite different approaches maybe, but I think it's kind of a natural instinct for us to want to understand our world and how it works. And I think they're both great modalities for that. So
right. And the whole process of experimenting, when you're designing a medical illustration, you have to go through a whole series of concept sketches and running it through your peers to see if things are connecting, and there's that whole trial and error process, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I was teaching a Zoom class, to a science class, to kids at one point, and I was trying to kind of sum up like what it takes to be a scientist. And I think something Fyodor always used to say to me was, do the experiment. And I think that's like it's such a good motto for like science, but also life, in the sense of like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this thing, do the experiment, like see how it goes, test it out. And I think it's such a fun process to like work with other people on those types of problems, right? And like get feedback. So
yeah, definitely. And there's so much creativity, like you said, involved in science. Like, you have to have a creative mind to come up with the right experiments and to think out of the box. Otherwise, you're not pushing the field forward at all. And that, of course, translates into art as well. But yeah, there's a ton of similarities, I think, between the two.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the pushing the boundaries thing, I totally agree. So I'm curious, are you on Twitter?
Yes.
Did you see Nate Silver's tweet the other day that got like a ton of response and backlash about? It was something like, people aren't gonna like me saying this, but I think after you get a PhD, you become 10 times harder to convince that you're wrong.
That's so interesting. I didn't see that.
Curious your take on that.
That is so interesting. I think
it got like over 50,000 likes and like hundreds of retweets.
I can kind of see that being true, maybe. Like, your whole PhD, you're being trained to think like a scientist, and you're being questioned whether you're doing the right experiment or not. And by the time you're done, you're probably like, I know how to do all of this. And yeah, you don't want to be questioned quite as much about whether you're right or wrong.
Yeah. suppose.
maybe. I would hope not, but I could see how maybe
Yeah.
that's a trend.
Yeah, for sure.
But also, I think PhDs teach you to, I mean, the purpose is to teach you to think strategically and to question things.
Yeah.
So I would hope that at the end of it, you're more open-minded and realize the limits of what you know and what
Mm-hmm.
your role is in trying to uncover different things about your field.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's kind of, for most of us, it was like humbling. You get to this realization of like, I know nothing and we know
Right.
nothing, and like, we've just barely scratched the surface on a lot of things. But yeah, I think as well, part of your dissertation is supposed to be generating new data or research and answering questions that haven't been answered before, which is a huge challenge, right? Because you have to have an understanding of like what's out there, and then
Right.
you have to figure out how you're going to push the boundaries and like ask important questions that haven't been asked. So
Yeah, no, definitely. This is kind of related, but it reminded me of a class I took in college. I had a professor named Charlie Gray. He does cognitive neuroscience research, and I had taken like his, neuroscience and mental illness class and his cognitive neuroscience class. And like at the end of, this whole series, he like ended the whole semester by saying like, okay, now you know all of these things. And he's like, but just remember, like if you're going to go into neuroscience, like we still don't even know how you can do this. Like we have no idea how you can just decide to move your finger. Like it's just
yeah.
crazy. And of course, we
Yeah.
know some of the mechanisms of it, but like at a deeper, theoretical level, it's like it's interesting to think about. There's just all these
Mm-hmm.
unanswered questions when you kind of take a step back and think about things in the big picture.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, one of my favorite examples of those is that, and I don't know if this is still true, like I think I heard this like 10 years ago or something, but our ability to like, if we're in a crowded room and multiple people are talking, our ability to like focus on the sound coming from the person we're talking to, like we don't get how that works.
Yeah, that's so incredible. How,
And like,
yeah,
people think that robots or AI is going to take over the world. I don't know. Yeah, maybe you can
yeah.
comment on like the singularity, and like, since you have worked in the neuroscience field, like what are your thoughts on that?
I just feel like I always have more to read about this subject. Like I don't have any strong opinions on it, but I do think I was listening to a podcast, here's another podcast by the DeepMind group. I think they're based out of London maybe, but they have a whole podcast on AI, and they were talking about the ability of AI to be really, it's really successful in situations where things are like a game. So they're really good at like Go, for example, and you can train an AI to solve this incredibly complicated game. But if you think about it, there's like rules and there are things that they can be trained on. And then, they were bringing up, how do you train an AI to know that when you're going home from work, tomorrow morning, you're going to want some orange juice. And so maybe I should stop by the grocery store on my way home from work to get some orange juice for tomorrow morning. Like that kind of a thing where it's not like a game with rules is incredibly difficult to train AI, agents on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of right now where the field is really digging into, because they're really trying to understand how you can train an AI to do those types of complicated things rather than just games with a set rule, for example.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it's so
yeah, it's all
interesting.
interesting.
I know a paper came out, I think it was last year, on training AI to play poker.
Mm.
And they actually got like a bunch of the top poker players in the world to play with it. And I don't think it didn't like beat them.
Yeah,
Like it did okay. I don't remember the exact stats, but it was, when I read the paper, I felt like they were like overreaching a little bit with their claims of like how good
interesting.
it was.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting example of like a game with rules, but then there's this like human component, right, of like reading
Right.
other people in the game and reading how they make decisions, and I don't know, it's a really fascinating area of AI, I think.
I totally agree. Yeah. And the whole creativity aspect of it, especially with Go. I don't know if you've seen the documentary about that that matchup, but you should see it if you haven't. But there was I think the final match in Go, the AI, or maybe it was the penultimate match, but um, the AI had they called it a creative move. Like they were like blown away because this move was like they had never seen it in a game of Go before, so it hadn't really been trained on this one certain move to make. But it was like
Really?
it showed like creativity. It was what they were talking about, and they were just like
Wow.
all blown away. And I think it won that match, and then of course it won the whole series. But yeah, it was an interesting point, I think, in the documentary where you're like, wow, creativity is a whole nother thing. Like, what is creativity, and
Yeah.
how is it, can you say an AI is creative?
Yeah.
I don't know much about it, but it's an interesting
What
question.
a what a like watershed moment for AI. I remember that, like, the paper, and it just, making a big splash in the news, and I
Yeah,
imagine the people who worked on it, that being like, one of those breakthroughs, like you're just so excited to like see this thing that you built working.
right.
Um have you had any moments like that in your own work where you're like, "Oh my gosh, I did it." Like I
I
can
think,
like
yeah, I no like major moments quite yet. I think I'm still pretty early in my career and learning what I like to do and what I'm good at. But um, I guess I won an award for my master's animation last year, which was probably the biggest accomplishment so far, at least in medical illustration for me. I won an award of excellence at our big AMI annual conference, so it was kind of nice to be recognized. And I think the amount of work that went into that, it was like, okay, this was worth it. It was
nice.
recognized, and yeah, so that was great.
That's awesome. Congrats. I didn't know
Thanks.
that.
Yeah, yeah, I got an award of excellence for my master's, and then I had an award of merit for another animation that I did in grad school as well. And of course, these were in the student category, but it was a good, it was a good encouragement that I'm on the right path, and I definitely love animation, so it's kind of
Mhm.
nice to know that people are recognizing you for your work.
Yeah. Are there any animators or illustrators that you like follow for inspiration?
Yeah, there's quite a few. The medical animation field is growing really substantially. So there's a lot of people that are diving into that. Vessel Studios is a really great animation studio that I follow, and then also Newt Studios. Their work is really beautiful and great. And then I try to follow a lot of like cinematic animators as well, just to try to pull, camera moves or visual effects from people outside of the medical animation industry, just to kind of add a new spin and elevate whatever graphics you're working on. But one of my favorites is Raoul Marks. He's an incredible animator. He worked on the Westworld title sequence, and
Oh,
then
wow.
yeah, and Patrick Clare, I think I don't know what his position is, but I think he did like the storyboarding and the concept work for that as well. And they've done a
Very
lot of title sequences. I think True Detective as well. Um, their company is called Antibody Studios, I believe.
okay.
Um, but yeah, I love their work, and I have them up on Vimeo like as a bookmark. I'm always
Oh, nice.
studying his work, and yeah, definitely one of my
Yeah, and for
favorites.
people who haven't seen the Westworld title sequence, it's kind of like this white liquid is being poured to form these bodies that are very anatomical, right? And
Yep.
spinning
Yeah.
around, and it's like it's definitely a really neat visualization there.
Yeah, and the sound design too is really, I think, impactful. They've got the player piano. I think that's what it's called, which is
Yeah.
cool. So it starts to play by itself. And actually, we were just talking about AI. I was just reading that in the recent season of Westworld, they actually used AI to like come up with these interesting scenes from previous seasons. It like pulled all of these scenes from previous seasons and came up with like these really warped views. I'm doing a bad job of describing it, but I'll send you the article later. But there are these
Cool.
images that were like informed by previous seasons, and they actually incorporated those into the new Westworld sequence. So there's like some AI elements in season 3 title sequence, which is very fitting for, you know, the hosts leaving the park and going out into the real world.
Yeah.
So it was very cool. Yeah.
That show definitely really, I think more so than a lot of other shows, made me think a lot about neuroscience and like the brain, and you know, it really plays with the like reality and our perceived realities and identity. And there was so much, like, I remember the first season especially just talking to so many people about it, and how, you know, how trippy it was, like thinking about these things. And
yeah, totally. You actually got me started watching it. I remember we were in the
I?
lab. Yeah, we were like in the wet lab and
Okay.
doing some chip-seek experiment probably. And you were like, I feel like you would really like Westworld. And I was like, yeah, it actually sounds pretty interesting. I do love it. It's a great show.
There's I also really like the movie Ex Machina. That was like one of my favorite movies.
So good.
That kind of plays with the same concepts, and you know, I love that one as well. I wonder, it's just amazing how far like some of these animations have come.
Yeah. No, that's such a great one. And, you know, on a different aspect of that movie, there was a lot of really cool choices in the color of the attire of the main character. So whether he was wearing like a lighter blue plaid shirt versus, I think towards the end of the movie started wearing like darker clothes, and it kind of was an interesting, like, you know, I think the audience, you pick up on that kind of subconsciously. But it played into his character development for sure. And then if you rewatch it, like paying attention to when they're shot in the shadows and what's in the background, like sometimes I think at the beginning of the movie he's shot with like blue skies, mountains behind him, and then towards the end he's shot, you know, right next to like a darker wall where there's no big background. And
wow,
that's an incredible movie.
Picked up on that.
I was reading
some. Watch it again now.
Yeah. If you rewatch it, I'll send you an article, and if you rewatch it, it's pretty fascinating. What, you know, in cinematography, like how you can add those tiny little details in, and it definitely influences your perception of a character throughout the plot. But
totally. Would you ever want to work in like film or
TV,
doing animation for something like that?
I think that'd be really fun. It's not something that I'm, you know, striving to do right now, but I think like pulling in some more of, you know, cinematic techniques into like medical or biomedical animation is a really important thing. I think it could, you know, make our animations even more, you know, known and impactful, I think. But I think it would also be fun to work in film, especially if you've seen The Mandalorian at all. And have you watched that show?
No.
It's a Disney Plus show, but they did this whole, it's like a Star Wars, it's a tangent, but
Disney Plus. I'm not on Disney Plus. That's like one of the ones I don't have. I think Finding Nemo is like the only Pixar animated movie that I like.
I'm not even sure if you would like The Mandalorian. It's like a Star Wars, it's like an extension on Star Wars, but they filmed the whole thing in this thing called the volume.
I haven't seen.
Yes, I know. But just I think I was watching like a you know, behind the scenes of how they filmed The Mandalorian, and just I don't know, they filmed it in this huge volume thing that was like all CG, and the actors were acting in this real, what looked to them like a real world, like Star Wars world, because all of the, you know, the surrounding volume was all CG created before they filmed the show. Yeah.
Oh my God. How
There's some really,
expensive is that?
I know, that's what that was my first question.
So are they
Yeah.
in like the green suits, and so they're, or do they have like their wardrobe on?
Yeah, so it's cool. They build the whole world before they actually film with actors. And so they have the cameras, and as they move, the CG world like adjusts. So you get parallax and all of the things that you need to make it feel real. And then the actors can actually see the world. There's no green screen. They can actually see the projections on this
Wow.
volume. So it's like adding another level onto acting too, because instead of having a green screen that you have to pretend that there's this, dust storm or something, they're actually seeing the dust storm. So I assume that it helps them in their acting to feel like they're really there.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah, there's some big advances in film right now. So anyways, to answer your question, that would be fun to work on eventually.
Okay, well, I think that's kind of all the questions that I had, and I had such a great time chatting with you, and I will do some editing and send you a copy. But thanks so much for joining the podcast. And
Yeah, this was really fun.
Probably be pinging you for some help with various art things in the near future. So
yeah, definitely. I know this was really fun. I'm glad you are starting a podcast now. It's like your next project, like you were saying.
My next project, yeah.
Yeah.
Got done with the book, and